Hi. In the first clip, I outlined a general prohibition of the use of force under both the UN Charter and customary international law, as well as the first exception to this rule, namely the use of forcible measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter by the UN Security Council. In the second clip, I would like to discuss the other exception to the prohibition of the use of force, namely the inherent right to self-defense. Like the prohibition of the use of force and the collective security system, the principle of self-defense is also explicitly established in the UN Charter, and specifically in Article 51, which states that nothing in the present Charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. The article goes on, but I would like to make a few observations specifically about this first, most important part of this provision. First, the right to self-defense is described as inherent, which means that it predates the UN Charter, and that Article 2.4, the establishment of a general prohibition of the use of force, does not actually change anything in this regard. States, when attacked, can still invoke and legitimately rely on the principle of self-defense, and the UN Charter not only accepts and endorses this principle, but it actually incorporates it within its collective security system. Another aspect worth mentioning is that Article 51 mentions both an individual and a collective right to self-defense. So you can defend yourself individually, of course, when you're attacked, but also importantly, you can rely on collective security arrangements, on alliances that provide for deterrence and that offer you the opportunity to defend yourself in a more effective way. And the obvious example here is, of course, NATO, which under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty obliges all members of the alliance to step in and defend another state when it is attacked. Now, given the centrality of the prohibition of the use of force under the UN Charter and international legal system in general, you will not be surprised to hear that there are a number of clear and important criteria that need to be met in order for something to qualify as self-defense under Article 51. The first one is that there needs to be an armed attack to which you're responding as a defending state. And this includes, of course, an attack by another state or states, but it can also be an attack by a non-state actor, in particular when this attack is also related or somehow attributable to another state. The paradigmatic example here is, of course, the reaction by NATO and all members of the alliance to the terrorist attacks of 9/11/2001, where Afghanistan was targeted after harboring the Al-Qaeda terrorists that were responsible for the attacks in New York and other places in the United States. And indeed, the UN Security Council recognized the collective action taken by NATO as legitimate instances of self-defense under the UN Charter and specifically Article 51. The second essential condition to be met is that your response, the exercise of self-defense, needs to be both necessary and proportionate. Necessary in the sense that there was and continues to be a real threat to the security of your state that warrants a military response. Proportionate in the sense that whatever action you're taking in response is actually proportionate to or comparable to the threat that you are facing. And this is probably best illustrated by means of example. So if a few shots have come across the border, something that would indeed constitute an armed attack, as the threshold under Article 51 is rather low, then a full-scale invasion of that country would not actually constitute a legitimate instance of self-defense. It would be disproportionate and therefore in violation of Article 51. Finally, as a defending state, you still have to respect the primacy of the UN Security Council, which, as we saw in the previous clip, holds primary responsibility under the UN Charter for maintaining international peace and security. So if the Security Council has taken a resolution, potentially even under Chapter 7 of the Charter, you as a defending state have to respect that resolution. And in fact, your right to defense ceases to exist, at least in this specific case. You also have to inform the UN Security Council of any measures that you take in the name of self-defense. This also is explicitly mentioned and established by Article 51 of the UN Charter. Another difficult question that regularly comes up not just in classroom discussions but also at international level concerns the use of anticipatory, preemptive or preventive self-defense. And we will see in a second that the precise wording matters quite a bit here actually. The starting point yet again is that the prohibition of the use of force is a cornerstone of the UN system and that therefore real constraints and conditions exist to responding also to a looming attack by another actor, by another state. The restrictive framework established by Articles 2.4 and 51 of the UN Charter does provide for the possibility of engaging in anticipatory self-defense, as we call it in international law, which is defined by the fact that it is in response to an imminent attack. And imminent attack is defined in turn by the statement that was given by US Secretary of State Daniel Webster, as explained in the textbook, who defined it as a response to a threat that is, and I quote, instant, overwhelming and leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. And nowadays this is commonly referred to as the Caroline Doctrine, named after the steamer Caroline that was at the heart of this specific incident that took place in the United States in the mid-19th century. The Caroline Doctrine is seen as the very minimum that a state needs to meet in terms of conditions when engaging in anticipatory self-defense, and some commentators have actually stated and argued that there needs to be an even higher threshold for such action to be legal, given indeed the restrictive nature of the UN system and the centrality of the prohibition of the use of force. What we can say for sure though is that preemptive and preventive self-defense are not in accordance with international law because they do not meet the criteria formulated in the Caroline Doctrine. So anything that refers to there being a likely attack, a possibility of an attack, that basically is a speculative reaction to something that is supposed to happen, just simply does not hold water under Article 51 and is therefore in contravention with Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. And the prime example here is, of course, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 by the United States and a number of allies based on the argument that the Iraqi government had developed weapons of mass destruction. In the end, no weapons of mass destruction were found, but even if they had been found, this invasion still did not actually respond to an imminent attack and was therefore quite clearly not in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter. This concludes this second video on self-defense. I now, in the third clip, will tackle the topic of humanitarian intervention.